Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to the St. Mary's County Government Retiree Benefit Trust, the OPEB committee meeting for Friday, February 26th at 9:30 a.m. We are meeting in the Chesapeake Building in Leonardtown. However, in accordance with the Public Health Advisory on public gathering sizes, the St. Mary's County Government OPEB meetings are accessible by viewing St. Mary's County Government TV 95 and on the St. Mary's County YouTube channel. For those without access to cable television or intranet, a listen-only line is available by calling 301-579-7236, access code 963443. Members of the press may attend. For additional information, please contact Michelle Rance at michelle.rance@stmarysmd.com. For this morning's agenda, we'll begin with a call to order. Present today is myself. I'm the County Administrator, Rebecca Bridget. To my left is Commissioner Michael Hewitt. Further to the left is Jeanette Cudmore, CFO. Also sitting at the administrator's table is Jody Quasney, our plan administrator. To my right is our citizen member, Mary Ann Murray, and Catherine Pratson, director of HR, and a member of our committee. Also, Michelle Rance, administrative coordinator. Thank you for joining us. And Amy Carter, our videographer, is filming today. So with all of that, we will start our meeting under roll call 2A for approval of the agenda today, please.
I move to approve the agenda.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion to approve the agenda for today's meeting and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. That moves us to 2B, which is approval of the meeting minutes for December 4th, 2020. If you take a minute to review the minutes, then we'll entertain a motion to approve.
I read mine last night. So.
Are you ready for a motion?
Well, no, I don't want you to look like I'm not reading my minutes. I've already read it.
Thanks for the tip.
Dr. Bridget, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from the December 4th, 2020 meeting.
Thank you. I have a motion on the floor. Is there a second?
I'll second.
So motion and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Item 3 is a presentation, and you mentioned on our agenda, Michelle, that Bolton Partners would like to go first.
Apologize for
so
that, yeah.
That's okay. Just wanted to make sure. And so we will begin with Bolton Partners with the July 1st, 2020 OPEB actuarial report. And Carrie and Tim are joining us via WebEx. So thank you very much. We'll turn the presentation over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Carrie. I work with Kevin at Bolton. He couldn't be here today because I think his daughter's getting married. So Tim, Barry, and I will be presenting the results to you guys. Tim's been with Bolton for about 5 years, and I've oddly enough worked at the company for 20 years. So as I go through, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to just cut in and ask them. I think that usually goes pretty easily that way. If not, we can address any other questions you guys have at the end. There is a report that we have. We gave a presentation. I don't know if you can bring it up or if you have it in front of you. I'll just start on page 3 of it, if that's okay.
Which one is it? I got 3 of them here.
It's page 3 of the St. Mary's County Government July 1, 2020 OPEB actuarial report. It's a presentation that we sent over. I think Jeanette had it. Okay, perfect. It's just a little background on slide 3 about what we're presenting today. Our first set of results are the actuarial evaluation report. We'll go through those numbers with you. And that's just to develop the actuarial determined contribution for 2022 and 2023. This ADC is a little more flexible than the old ARC standard. Under GASB 45, the standard from maybe 4 years ago now, you had this concept of an expense that you were booking on your CAFRs every year, but they came along and they replaced it with GASB 75, and there's really no more concept of this expense that you're putting on. So it leaves a little flexibility for people to determine how they want to approach funding their plans, whereas before GASB 45 had more rules about it. Here there's really no concept of an expense that, you have to report and fund to. So that's all we're talking about there. It's the numbers that we're presenting are based on the June 2020 demographic data, and we looked at the claims experience from April 2018 to April 2020. We could have gone farther, but right now, because of COVID, we've decided to exclude periods after March and April, usually because a lot of things got really kind of wonky when everything shut down, and a lot of people were delaying health care, so we were seeing large drops. So for this purposes now, we just excluded after April. We're still waiting to see what the real net effects are, and we'll go over that a little bit more later. But we used 2 years of data. It's just pushed back a little bit to look at your claims experience. We wanted to get an accurate representation. We didn't want to have a large claims drop that didn't really exist because, in quarter 4 and maybe quarter 1 of this year, your claims experience has, increased and offset what was happening during the beginning months of COVID. And the second set of numbers that we're going to go through are separate reporting for accounting under the GASB 75 standard. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But right now, we'll start by going to the ADC numbers for you. And Tim is going to do the next slide on slide 4.
Before you get started, Mike here,
Carrie.
Commissioner.
Can everyone? Go ahead.
All right.
Sure.
My turn? All right, Mike Hewitt, Commissioner. Are you saying that, I'm sorry, Carrie, I don't like to really call people by their first name. What's your last name?
Szabo.
Szabo? Okay, Ms. Szabo, tell me, these numbers you're talking about now, they're non-COVID? This is all pre-COVID?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the claims experience. We excluded after April just because of COVID. And, well, they might not have been available when we started doing the valuation, but we would have excluded them anyway. A lot of people stopped going to the doctor when this first started. So for other clients, we're experiencing large decreases, in later months in 2020 due to COVID. People were delaying care. We don't know that that would be representative of what the actual cost of we're trying to develop an assumption for what your plan costs. Those delayed care, the idea is that people will actually go back to the doctor and get that care. People were just maybe delaying going to get a routine physical and stuff, so that wouldn't be showing up in your claims numbers, but eventually they will show back up. So we want to make an assumption for what your plan costs, assuming that these people weren't going and seeing these large decreases. So we just excluded them.
Okay, well, you talk about our experience based, I guess you're talking about our experience mod, our loss ratio type of thing. I guess that's what you're referring to as far as experience. But I guess my point is, this whole COVID thing has fouled up everybody as far as budgeting and Lord knows forecasting. When will we expect some type of report from Bolton on how COVID's impacted us?
We actually have a slide about that a little bit later in the presentation.
Oh, okay. All right.
Some of it, we can see recovering right away, but some things, it could be years until we really understand, like maybe what the mortality impact would be on something, on people. We just don't know. So we don't see, for instance, maybe like a younger person who had COVID, who has, maybe what are the lasting impacts of this disease that they had. Are there any? We're not really sure what that is yet. So some assumptions will recover very quickly, and we'll know. We can see, in a year over year that, maybe your claims went down and then they pop back up because, as medical facilities and stuff, and the numbers went down, people started going back to the doctors and they got more comfortable. But maybe like a mortality assumption, it may take years to understand what the true impact is. But things you guys probably already have experienced or maybe are gathering data on are, you may be seeing an increase in retirements right now, or people not leaving because of fear of the economy. Those types of things we'll realize a little quicker. Does that make sense?
Yes, I guess what I just worry about is making assumptions based upon non-COVID impacts, and we're right in the middle of COVID impacts. And we really haven't, seen the effects long-term as far as revenue. We're usually 12, 16 months behind in revenue flows, but also as far as people getting sick and, not coming back, and we're hearing a lot of different things. So it's a lot of information to gather together. One thing I did see, and again, I follow the Wall Street Journal and different periodicals, and the point is that they're saying that COVID's taken a year off of our life expectancy, and the morbid part of me says, well, maybe that'll make it cheaper. We're not living as long. I know I'm sorry, it's a bad joke, but go ahead.
I know, and there's opposing things where things are. It's really complicated. I know. Kevin is working on, he's been gathering mortality data because he worked specifically with the SOA on setting mortality assumptions, and he's been gathering all sorts of data to look at it and see trends in it. It's just a little too soon to tell for some things, but other things I think we'll see a lot faster. The workforce and how it's changing, those types of things. Hopefully we'll be done with COVID, all sorts of COVID restrictions this year, fingers crossed, and then, we can see how the charts change due to it a little bit easier, more clearly.
Okay, well, I'll keep my questions till you're done. I'll let you get finished.
No, it's okay. For the claims assumption, we didn't want to put in a large decrease and understate the liability of your plan. So we left pre-COVID experience, only, and then just kind of excluded that for now, knowing that, we will have to include it in the future, but right now it could just be a blip, or it could have a larger increase. But we do have increased assumptions for your claims to go up annually anyway. So we are kind of covering our bases there, where we make an assumption for what your plan costs, but we do expect it to increase in the future. And those trend rates are set by economists and have a transparent kind of thing to it. So Tim will go through that with you when he goes through the results. But we do have a set increase that these costs are going to go up. Just we want to be conservative. We don't want to tell you your plan costs, $1 million when it really costs $5 million. So we try our best to be very conservative in our liability basis.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Tim, do you want to do slide 4?
Yes. Can you hear me, Carrie?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Barry here with Carrie presenting for Bolton. This slide 4 covers the contribution policy from our pre-COVID meeting. On behalf of Bolton, Kevin Binder and I presented the results of a study on the county's contribution policy 1 year ago. The purpose of the study was to analyze the impact of the county drawing from the OPEB trust under 3 alternative scenarios, those being the county contributing only the plan's PAYGO costs each year, the county withdrawing $1 million from the trust, and the county withdrawing $3.5 million annually from the trust. Bolton provides an additional we typically provide an actual determined contribution for the county based on 100% funding target, but the county has recently only been contributing on a pay-as-you-go basis due to the plan's high funding status. Some other governments that we work with have set their funding targets lower than 100%. Reducing the funding target limits the likelihood of the plan becoming overfunded and provides a level of benefit security to the county. We suggest that the county consider taking the same approach given their current funding level. By withdrawing $1 million from the trust each year, the county's funding ratio remained relatively level at around 79% over the 10-year period. Similar funding results can be accomplished by setting the county's funding target to 80%. The projections we performed did not account for experience gains or losses, so setting a funding target would enable the drawdown to be adjusted higher or lower depending on the experience year to year. This approach provides more of a transparent funding rationale since the ADC will be actuarial determined, and it wouldn't be like an arbitrary drawdown each year, so that transparency is useful. For the purposes of the presentation today, we will focus on the actuarial determined contribution for the county's OPEB plan for the fiscal years 2022 and 2023 based on an 80% funding target. If you go to the next slide of the presentation, or slide 6, here are the key OPEB funding results. They can be found on page 5 of the July 1, 2020 OPEB actual valuation report. The July 1, 2018 valuation, which Bolton also produced, determined the county's contribution to the OPEB trust for the 2020 and 2021 fiscal years. The discount rate has remained level at 6% since 2007 or 2008. The discount rate assumption is set by the county and is flexible for funding valuations, but it needs to be calculated under GASB 75 standards for the accounting disclosures. The liabilities have increased by roughly 16%, mostly due to the passage of time and unfavorable claims experience over 2 years. The impact this
look, I need to interrupt you just for a second. Okay, you're saying that about $16.5 million is due to claims experience over the last 2 years, and it's due to
a significant portion is due to the unfavorable claims experience, yes, and also the expected increase due to the passage of time.
Okay, help me with that part. Expected increase due to the passage of time. I'm going to write that down. What's that mean?
You know, that's just the idea that people are going to earn benefits over the next year. They're going to work another year, earn more benefits, and inflation occurs. Those types of things that you're going to your benefits, your liabilities are going to increase annually with just somebody working another year and earning another year of service, those types of ideas. Does that make sense?
No, but look, I know just enough to be dangerous here. So, I just don't understand how we went from this 106, which has kind of been one of the numbers I've been focused on for a long time. Now it's jumped to 122. Now, if you're saying our claims are way up, then hey, look, I get that. I was a businessman. I understand how it works when you have high claims. I just didn't know what our claims modification, what our experience rating was. So if it was, I mean, the world I was in was always 1.0 was good. Anything below 1 was even better as far as claims ratios, and anything above 1 was bad. And that indicated you paid higher fees. So I'm assuming I don't know what our claims expense was, so it must, you know, you guys must know. Go ahead.
It looked like a 10% increase over 2 years, I think, for your claims for our assumptions, what we saw. So, and you're over 65. So there was a significant increase over a 2-year span.
I missed the first part of that.
And Carrie, the healthcare cost trend was assuming a much lower rate than that 10% increase, probably closer to like 4 or 5%, you'd say?
Yep.
Okay.
So this is Jeanette.
So that drove the majority of the increase.
Right. So when you looked at our claims data from April 18 to April 2020, this is where you're drawing that assumption from, right?
Right. And specifically claims for over 65.
Right. Right.
So it's specifically the claims of the retirees in the plan.
Right.
Do we have that data on the county side? Does your office keep that data?
Yes, I'm sure I can find it, because when we go through the rate renewal every year, it's going to be based on claims experience.
I guess what's confusing me is we tend to get rebates every year over the last few years from healthcare. Doesn't seem like we'd be getting that if our claims ratio was higher.
So we have a stop-loss insurance policy, and for the past few years, a significant amount of claims we have not experienced because the stop-loss has protected us. And we're in a...
That not going to continue?
Well, we're in a renewal right now, and Care First wants to modify that stop-loss because they have absorbed so much of the expense. So we don't have a large number of claims, but we have a large number of high claims, or, a number of high.
I'm with you. Yeah, you good. Okay.
And I'm sorry, Carrie, I think I interrupted
into
you.
our assumption. It's okay. I was just going to say we build that stop loss into our assumption
Okay.
as well. We do have other clients that are experiencing this, and we have a group of people that work on. They could help you. I know you just said you're going through your claims renewal process, but they have ideas. So, I mean, if you want to reach out separately from this meeting, we can talk to you about ways to possibly things to put in that you could help reduce your costs post 65.
Thank you. And we work with Mark Lynn on that. So.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Yep.
Then you already are talking to our guy.
We do, daily. So thank you.
He has the answers. Yeah, it's not uncommon. This is it's a problem, but yep. And we build the stop loss into our estimates. It's been expensive. It went up a lot.
It did. Yeah, it went up a lot. Yeah.
Any other questions from the board? Okay, Tim, I think you can resume. We were on page 6.
Yes. Where was I? So you could see the funding target was decreased from 100% to 80%. This drove the actuarial determined contribution lower from that $4,775,000 to $4,062,000. That was the main driver of the decrease in the ADC. The funded percentage decreased slightly. The liabilities have increased by roughly 16%, as noted before. The estimated market value of assets as of July 1st, 2021 was determined based on the July 1, 2020 market value of assets, which was around $89.4 million. And we assume that the county would contribute the 2021 ADC based on an 80% funding target. This calculation is in the report on page 1. Yes. So if we go to the next slide, I'll go through the ADC reconciliation. The fiscal year ending 2021 ADC recalculated based on the 80% funding target was $3,359,000. The unfavorable claims experience mentioned before caused the largest increase in the contribution. The over age 65 costs increased by around 10% over each of the 2 years, and the passage of time and unfavorable asset experience combined with a smaller than expected contribution during fiscal year 2020 contributed to the loss as well. Favorable demographic experience and updating the medical trend as well as the mortality tables partially offset this increase. Do any of you have any questions regarding the reconciliation of the ADC for this valuation?
Any questions, Pat? Or
Yes, good morning, everyone. Just quickly, for the funding ratio, are you guys just using the market value or are you using a 5-year smoothing that's, generally found elsewhere? Is it just the market value? Look, it appears that way based on these pages.
Yes. we're utilizing the market value of assets. We're not performing any sort of asset smoothing.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. Any other
thing.
questions? Okay.
Okay. The next slide covers the key methods and assumptions, and this is for the funding report. The projected unit credit actuarial funding method was used to determine the liabilities. This method measures the present value of liabilities as a percentage of service as of the valuation date compared to the service at retirement for participants. 16-year level percentage of payroll amortization of the unfunded liability, assuming an 80% funding target, is combined with the normal cost to determine the ADC for fiscal year 2022. This decreases to a 15-year period for the 2023 ADC. As the amortization period decreases, the volatility in the ADC will increase. We think that it would be a good idea to manage amortization pieces in tiers as this amortization period gets much lower. Carrie, do you have any comments on at what point maybe we'd consider something like managing the amortization pieces as in tiers rather than in total?
I think you probably want to start considering it, soon. The idea is, any sort of gain or loss you have is just getting amortized over, a decreasing period. So 16 years and 15 years, in 5 years, it's going to be 10 years, 9 years. And any sort of loss you get as you get down closer, it's just, it can be over 2 years or 1 year. So it's going to add a lot of volatility to your expense number. So what we offer to people is, you keep decreasing this initial period and then just start including any sort of gain or loss that you're incurring each year after. Like, so you set this base, and then in future years, as you start incurring new gains and losses, you have 15 years to pay them off as well. So a lot of people do this, really just this initial unfunded to try to get to a funding target. You guys are pretty close. You're very well funded. So just to manage the volatility is the idea in your numbers going forward. And it's a prospective change. It wouldn't change anything going backwards. So even if you were to install it this year, we wouldn't have a new amortization base until we did another valuation next year. So you wouldn't see any change in your numbers now. You would just see them in your out years going out, where, when this base is at 2 and you have a large loss, you're not amortizing that loss over 2 years. You're amortizing it over 15 because it's new.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. So the long-term, as mentioned before, the long-term expected return on assets and the discount rate have remained unchanged at 6%. The healthcare trend was developed based on the latest SOA model that was updated in September 2019. This trend assumed a 2.5% rate of inflation. We've removed the impact of the excise or Cadillac tax from the trend per the December 2019 federal appropriations bill, which eliminated the excise tax on high-cost plans that was part of the Affordable Care Act. The demographic assumptions, besides mortality, mirror those used for the county's pension plan valuation. For mortality, the SOA recently published an experience study on the mortality rates for public sector plans. We use the headcount-weighted mortality tables for general and public safety employees, retirees, and disabled retirees, and applied the MP 2019 mortality improvement scale to these rates. Go to the next slide. I'll go over the assumptions that were changed. As mentioned before, the OPEB plan uses a more expensive headcount-weighted mortality rates compared to the amount-weighted tables used for the pension plan valuation. For OPEB, each participant is equally weighted compared to pension, where the mortality tables are based on what people are earning, where those who earn more money are expected to live longer. So the mortality assumption does not account for the impact on COVID, the impact that COVID might have on the population's mortality. Carrie will go into further details later in the presentation on this potential impact. The mortality improvement scales released by the SOA have been gradually scaling back, gradually scaled back the past few years. And as mentioned before, the Cadillac tax was repealed and the medical trend was updated. Do any of you have any other questions regarding the assumptions?
Any questions or comments from the committee?
I'll let you get finished.
Not at this time,
Okay,
Tim.
Thank you.
All right, so on page 10, we just are summarizing other portions of the report that we feel are important. We don't want them to be overlooked. Section 4 is our plan provisions, and that's where we write up a detailed description of what we're valuing. This is the basis of how we're creating the liabilities for your plan. So we want people to look through this and make sure that that mirrors what your plan actually is, and we have it correct. Otherwise, your liabilities are incorrect. So we just ask everyone to look through that section and make sure it coheres with, the benefits you're actually offering to your members. Section 5 of our report includes data summaries. So we always think that's a good thing for people to just look through and make sure the counts that we're coming up with for people who are covered under your plan or receiving benefits as retirees really lines up with what you have in your databases and that everything looks sound. The Section 6 is the assumptions that we make, both demographic and economic. Some of the economic ones, they're just based on trend models and things as such, but the demographic ones, we would like, people to review them and make sure they're lining up with what kind of experience you're seeing at the county for people retiring and electing benefits. Those types of assumptions can have an impact on the liabilities that we calculate. So if you really don't see a lot of people retiring at age 55, but we have a large assumption there, maybe we should revisit that. So it's always good to read through these sections of the report just to make sure they line up with how your plan is being administered and the amount of people that are in it. Next page, on page 11, we have a 10-year forecast under the 80% funding target from the valuation report. And this, I think, is a great slide just to see a projection of what could be for your plan going forward of, your ADC costs, which are kind of highlighted midway through the page. And you can see that they're going up relatively stably. And this is just assuming that you're going to fund the plan to an 80% mark. Your percent funded stays pretty stable. And we'll go on it a little bit more. I have a better slide on the next slide. But at the bottom, you can see your benefit payout stream rolling out as well. And I know that before there was some interest in, we have this trust and when are we going to start drawing down the trust, or when is appropriate to? So this 80% funding target, if you look at the next slide, you see you have an immediate almost drawdown of your trust for the first year for FY22. Your actuarial determined contribution is $4.06 million, but your expected pay-go cost is $4.37 million. So you would have a small trust drawdown of $300,000, and that would slowly increase over time to until 2026 when you're getting a $1 million trust drawdown based on this 80% funding approach. So I know when the study was completed earlier this year, where you were looking at scenarios of taking out $1 million or $3 million, this was the offering for something that's more actuarial in basis for an approach to funding your plan. And Kevin is working on a white paper for a large Maryland county about this specific funding methodology right now. So we can forward that to you if you guys have interest when that's all complete. But I think his idea is really you just don't want to have an arbitrary trust drawdown. So you have a funding approach that's actuarial, it's transparent, it has a methodology that's followed. And if with that target, if there's a trust drawdown that occurs, that's how it occurs, rather than saying we're going to take out, $2 million this year or $1 million this year. That's his approach, and that's why this 80% funding target is where we've lied with the modeling. Hopefully that makes sense. On the next page, page 13, I'm just summarizing the assumptions that we put into this. It was a 6% long-term rate of return on assets, and that's what you used to determine your ADC. We assumed an open group, which means we have an expectation that people will retire and terminate the plan, but we also are building into this modeling an expectation that those people who leave are replaced by new people, new hires into the plan that would also get the benefit. So it's trying to model like a replacement so that your population stays stable over time, that, you have, 25 people in this work area. It's always going to be 25 even as these people exit the plan. And we replace the people who are exiting with, we take a mix of the new hires from recent years and look at what their ages and their statistics are, and that's how we build what the replacements are for them. And we assume there's no plan changes to the future and no future gains or losses. So we assume that your assets are going to earn 6% going out in the future. So we know that's not realistic, but you can change those types of things. But it does give you a good model to look at based on how your pay-go costs will work in relation to your ADC in future years. If anyone has any questions, you can type in. Otherwise, we're going to switch to accounting, which is a different beast. So if you want to talk about this more, we can do that, or we can wait till the end.
Any other questions on the actuarial report?
Now, what are we matriculating? What are we going to do now?
We're going to go into the accounting results.
No, okay, so it's still part of the same presentation. Yeah. Now, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Tim.
All right, thanks, Carrie. Okay, so if you go to slide 15, so this year we performed a roll forward valuation for the fiscal year ending 2020 GASB 74 and 75 disclosure based on the 2019 accounting report. 2 assumption changes were made. The healthcare trend was updated similarly to the funding report. And we recalculated the discount rate, which turned out to be the expected rate of return of 7.08%. Assets underperformed expectations, but the net decrease in accrued liability, mostly due to the healthcare trend assumption change, improved the funding percentage from 89% to 94%. The increase in benefit payments for the prior year highlight the claims experience pointed out in the funding report, so that number 3.7 million increase from the 3.4 million kind of highlights the claims experience we were noticing and accounting for in the funding results. So next year, their accounting results will be based off of the July 1, 2020 funding report that we've gone over, which includes those unfavorable claims. So we expect the funded status to decrease as a result for the accounting, the next accounting disclosure. Go to the next page. Carrie can discuss the differences between the funding and accounting results.
Okay. We have a little summary of the differences between funding and accounting, because now you're seeing different asset numbers and different liability numbers, and they're sort of similar and they're at different dates, and it can get a little confusing. So the funding numbers that we went over previously, their purpose is to calculate a trust contribution. If you're trying to fund your plan, we have plans that don't fund at all. They don't calculate this. They don't go through this exercise. They're just paying a pay-go cost, and they don't go through this exercise. But people who are trying to fund their plan and have assets, they like to know, what do we need to put in to get to a certain funding percentage. So we calculate a funding number for them. And this has a little more leeway to it. It's not governed by GASB in any way. So we used a 7/1/2021 date and a discount rate of 6%, which was chosen by the county. And the assets we estimated, because we don't have 7/1/2021 assets yet, so we were estimating that based on market value. And that just assumes, you're going to get 6% return and rolling forward for, a certain period of months. And that's using the projected unit credit cost method, which is what you've always used previously. So when you switched over from GASB 45 accounting to GASB 75 accounting, you just kept your funding method the same. So your methodology for calculating your ADC has just remained the same, even though the accounting standards have changed. So the accounting standards are for your CAFR, your financial reporting. They're required to be as of June 30, 2020. So we cannot estimate your assets as of that date. We need to know exactly what your assets are and report it as of that time. So we have to get the market value as of 7/1/2021 before we can complete your disclosure reports for you. That's just their rules. They also require that we use an entry age normal funding method under the standard. And the discount rate, when they put the standard in effect, they wanted more transparency with the discount rate. So they did prescribe certain rules that you had to follow to calculate your discount rate. They want it to be based in reality. So if you're not funding your plan, you have to use a bond rate. And if you are funding your plan, you can use the expected rate of return on your assets. So that's what your numbers are using your discount rate. And what we do is we take your assets and we do a run out, and we basically look at when the plans are expected to become insolvent. And at that point, we use the bond rate to discount things back to today's date using the bond rate when plans are insolvent. When they're not, we can use the expected rate of return on assets. So for you guys, you can see you were never projected to become insolvent, which is great news. So we're using your expected rate of return on your assets for this. Okay, and Tim can talk about the sensitivities on page 17.
Included with the accounting results, GASB requires us to disclose a sensitivity analysis for the discount rate and for healthcare cost trend, the healthcare costs. As you can see, even a 1% change can be significant to both the discount rate and healthcare costs. So a 1% increase to the healthcare costs, which would result in a 5% long-term healthcare trend, increases the total OPEB liability from $95.6 million to $114.75 million. So this kind of highlights just how variable results can be based on the experience of the plan. Anyone have any questions regarding the sensitivity analysis?
Any questions on page 17?
No, you're I don't understand it, but keep going.
Okay. Kara, you want to discuss the expected rate of return?
Sure. And just on the sensitivities, I think it's often overlooked in our reports, but it is a valuable tool to be able to look at those numbers and say, if we were thinking about dropping our discount rate, 50 basis points, you can take a look at those numbers and see, well, 1% is really having this kind of effect. OPEB plans are just a lot more volatile than pension plans, and we have these assumptions for increases in costs and stuff, and if they don't pan out, you could be looking at, if we have to switch the trend up, maybe due to COVID, or down due to COVID, you can see what kind of effect it will have on your liabilities and your net OPEB liability, and those directly go on your book. So they're good. They're good to feel your way around and kind of have a familiarity with them. On page 18, we're just going over the expected rate of return for accounting, which is 7.08% was based on a prior capital market analysis. Right now, we're seeing many investment managers recommending like a decreasing rate. So we would recommend that you guys, before we do the valuation coming up this summer, maybe we could update that expected rate of return. We know the bond rates have been low, so I think it's good to take a fresh look at it and make sure that we're using the right discount rate. 7.8%. It could go down a little based on what the bond rates are, and we're seeing other people do it. We had a large county in Maryland have a 70 basis point decrease based on that. So it's something. It just put it on your radar, but we probably would want to connect with your investment managers to see what your investment mixes are and what those expected returns are, so we can recalculate that rate for this year. It may change based on what your asset mix are. Okay. And then the slide you're all been waiting for, slide 19, COVID-19. We talk about it with everyone, but I feel like I'm just telling everyone we don't know yet. And so, sorry, I'm going to tell you guys we don't really know yet. There's a lot of assumptions we make in our valuing of liabilities through our ProVal, our tool that calculates all the numbers. And right now, there's a lot of outstanding things with COVID that just may not quite be understood yet. Mortality is a big one. We need to understand, are there lasting impacts for younger survivors? Younger people who had COVID, do they have long-term health impact from this disease? We don't know. We probably won't know for years. But it would have an impact on a mortality assumption, like you were talking about before, that it's shaved a year off of everyone's life. It's possible. I don't know that the data's there, but it's possible. We're looking at a lot of the deaths that did occur to COVID. Unfortunately, were in the older population, and sometimes that may not have an effect, or it may have an offsetting effect to what the younger survivors is. Those people may have been expected to die or not live very long anyway, so the mortality impact of that could kind of offset what we were talking about with the younger people earlier. Could there be less deaths in the next few years? Other types of things, or could there be more for delayed care? So we're still working through what the mortality impact is, and likely won't know for a while about that. Healthcare costs. We did see a lot of people with quarter 2 and quarter 3, like large decreases in their healthcare costs, but that's likely due to people delaying their treatment. So it's possible that could lead to greater future healthcare costs. If you have a condition, but you're just not going to the doctor to take care of it right now, it's just worsening, and it's not going to get better. It's just going to get more expensive to treat down the road. So that's something everyone's kind of taking into account. That, along with mental health care cost increases, that's been a real big issue. A lot of people are really suffering through this. I saw some studies that were showing just like the most impacted groups were like women, and they're saying women are leaving the workforce, and they just don't know, but it's impacting everyone at this point. And there's going to be a health cost attached to that, as well as the lasting impacts for younger survivors if they have increased medical conditions due to COVID. So the healthcare cost, that will probably take a few years to really sort out, but we should see claims usage and stuff come back to normal levels. I know in the beginning, drug claims really skyrocketed as everyone was stockpiling, and then they plummeted. And I think the last thing I was looking at is that they look like they're appearing to be back at normal levels at this point, where people aren't, crazy stockpiling. They're just going back to regular usage patterns. So we saw a large increase and a large decrease, and now it's like leveling back out. So hopefully for healthcare costs, the same will occur within the next year or so. And other impacts for turnover and retirement. Are people retiring more right now, or are they waiting it out just because of the economy? You probably have seen, you probably actually know some of this. I wonder, have you experienced in the county more retirements due to COVID, or do you think people are delaying?
This is Catherine. We've experienced more retirements.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know we did adjust for a school district. We started making an adjustment for one school district. The doubled the retirement incidence for like just 1 year because they said so many people were like, I'm not going back to work, and they just left the workforce. So people who are eligible to retire, we just doubled the amount just to try to model that increased retirement assumption. And it's something we could look at for you guys too, where we don't know, we may have to adjust, our termination or retirement assumptions, and it's something we can do to just more accurately model your costs.
We'll take a look
And
at.
then that is it.
Oh, excuse me, just as you suggested, we'll
Okay.
take a look at those assumptions in the report and try to do some analysis and let you know if we think that should be doubled.
Okay,
Thank
perfect. And that's our presentation. So we're here if you guys have any questions.
Okay.
Great, thank you very much. Questions or comments for Bolton Partners?
Yeah, I have a few. Commissioner Hewitt, it seems like what I'm experiencing here is that our actual valuation of our OPEB is higher than you're showing. And I think we've been having a better return coming on and then what we're showing here. I mean, maybe it all can correct, but I thought I read a report yesterday that had that valuation up around 107 million. My question to you is, how accurate, you use numbers that were, what, a year old as far as where we were to make these evaluations? You're talking about, well, I shouldn't say a year old, but June 30th of last year, 8-9 months? That's a question.
Oh, yep. I think so, yes. Tim, we used the data as of June and July 1st, right?
The June 1st, 2020 census data was used for this valuation.
Okay, and you
And the
exclude...
reason being...
Go ahead.
Oh, and the reason being is, you're preparing your budget, so a lot of times you want to know this number sooner than later for your ADC.
Right.
Okay. Well, I guess what I would say to you is that I've always believed we had forward-funded this OPEB too much, and I believe it's a generational disparity for older people in the workforce who have put in more than the younger people, and they pay the younger people's benefits out, years out with this thing. Anyway, let me get right to the point. I don't understand. It seems like we're doing better on our investments than you're saying, and that we actually should be close to actually having our account funded, totally funded, fully funded. If it was the 106.3 number we were dealing with, now we're dealing with the 122. Walk me through a little bit of the 80% targeting. Why does that drive it from 106 to 122? Now, you talked about it, increased experience claims, healthcare claims, and by people especially over 65. But if we have this stop loss involved, it just seems like we've been mitigated. I guess what I've seen the reality is, in my seat as a commissioner, is that we've actually seen pretty stable health care increases over this time frame you're talking about. I mean, I was used to days, I was one time on the Board of Education, and we used to have double-digit increases back then. I'm not trying to say that we're not going there. We could go there. But I still say a couple of things. First one is, when you talk about these people who didn't get health care done because it was some kind of an elective, now, I'm not sure exactly what that would have been. That would have gradually gotten worse and worse and worse, and they still weren't going. But let's say that's out there. But I would say to you this: these medical facilities, they can only do so many procedures. So if you get a backlog of so many, I bring this up from personal experience. I needed to get a procedure done that was somewhat, and I had to go up to Washington Hospital Center for it, and they couldn't get to me for 5 months. And I remember saying to the guy, what's the deal? He said, Mr. Hewitt, we got a big backlog, and we can only do so many a day. So back to this thing about our health care is going to increase because of the backlog of people who didn't get, I'm not sure I'm buying into that, I guess is what I'm saying. So,
Oh, it's not increasing due to the backlog. It's increasing your cost. The long term from the COVID impact, the cost could be increasing because of delayed care. Not maybe for like a knee surgery, but for someone who has like a disease that they're not managing properly right now because they're not going to the doctor. So it's just getting worse. So if you think of, I don't know, someone who's like diabetic who could probably, if they were going to the doctor, be managing that, you know, through diet or whatever, but they're not going to the doctor. So this disease is not getting any better because they're not treating it. It's getting worse. And now they maybe have to, you know, do shots and take pills and all sorts of stuff. So their delayed care, the fact that they're not going to the doctor now, is going to result in higher costs later on for them because they're not managing the types of disorders. They're not managing the disorder properly because they don't want to go to the doctor because of COVID. Does that make more sense?
no, I get it. I mean, I understand both sides of the argument. I'm
Okay.
just not sure that again, I don't want to get hung up on a point like that. I guess it all gets back to the ADC and what's required. So obviously, if you're higher than the 96 or 4 number or whatever we were talking about here, 95 on June 20th, and it's 107. I mean, that's only $12,000. I mean, $12 million. But I guess my point is doesn't that lower the ADC the higher the value of the fund of the plan?
Is the higher the what?
The
higher
value of
ADC, the
our
higher the value?
OPEB. You got 90. What do you got here? Fiduciary net position of our assets at, I guess I'm looking at 89. I'm on page, slide 15, accounting results.
Okay.
And I see, it says 630.20 of 89 million. Is that I would assume that's our net fiduciary position with this OPEB. Is that true?
Yep. You have a net OPEB liability as of 6/30/2020 of $6.2 million. So basically, you're unfunded $6 million on an accounting basis. Yep. But you're using a different discount rate for accounting than for funding. You use a lower discount rate, so your liabilities will be higher.
All right. Well, I guess my
You're
thought.
using 7.08.
Okay, I probably have more questions I need to work through in my mind before I take up everybody's time with this.
It's okay. It seems like you're questioning, like, we're almost funded, so why are we putting more money in? Is that what you're trying to say?
Kind of like that. It gets to be like
Okay.
we're constantly chasing a number, and the number keeps going up. And I guess I can see it going from 106 to 122 if we have an expansion in the workforce, or if we have, we got more
Right.
people signing up or more people making claims, and that may be what it is. What confuses me is what I've seen from our healthcare cost, that they've been somewhat stable, or not that they've gone up a lot. Now, I mean, Ms. Pratson, you may correct me on that.
Well, I agree with you in the fact that our renewal rates have been stable.
Yeah, we've gotten rebates.
And in fact, in this coming year, the renewal rate's estimated at 2.5%.
Right.
See, which I believe is a very, that's keeping up maybe with inflation, 2.5.
Right. But I will get the claims experience for the retirees. I can get you that because that may shed some light. Another thing that we experienced this year is more people enrolled in the plan through that Affordable Care Act. So more of our hourly employees enrolled, I think because of COVID, than they have before.
Okay,
So-
but I would also say this, is hopefully they're younger. Our hourly people
Yes and no.
tend to, okay. I would hope they're younger, let's just say that, okay? Now, what we've been talking about doing on the commissioner level is expanding the pool of people who can get retiree benefits. And mainly people who serve for shorter periods of time than, i.e., say, commissioners. But the point is that it would increase the health cost payout for a long time. I mean, if someone served 12 years as commissioner and got a 85-15 healthcare split with 85 picked up by the county, it would seem like, and they would have that for the rest of their life, that could be quite an impact on the plan too. It's a small number, thank God, but it could add up over time. I just need more time to get my head around this. This is, again, I know I'm a businessman, but I just don't quite get everything you guys are saying, and I need to get my Google out and sit down and figure out what the heck you're talking about.
Okay, well, when you're looking at the 106 on page 6, the 106 number and the 122 number, just remember that you're looking at the one number is as of 7/1/2018. And in our assumptions, we have built in that claims and things will increase over time because they just do. So you're looking at a number that's 2 years old and comparing it to a number for today. So if we had taken that number, the 106 number, and really brought it into today's terms and put it as of 7/1/20, you were probably looking at a number that would be like 115 or 116 at that point. And that's just, we're assuming in cost increases that things get more expensive and there's inflation and stuff. So
All right,
when you're comparing this 106 to the 122, yeah, it's really, I think you're looking 2 years back and we're saying this is what it was 2 years ago when we gave you the report, and this is what it is today. But if we were looking at the 2 years ago, we said this is what it would have been today, you'd be looking at something a little bit more similar. I hope that makes sense.
No, I can plug those things in myself. I get it. I just feel like I'm always chasing something that the goalpost keeps moving. Right. I think I'm there. I got a touchdown. Now you got another 20 yards to go. It just gets to be
I think
confusing.
These plans are very volatile. Just their assumptions based around claims and increases in medical costs. There's such a different beast than pension plans are. Right. And so, yes, numbers can just go up and down and all over the place based on little changes that we make, like, removing the Cadillac tax, which you had no control over. It's just an excise tax that was in law, and removing it had a great impact for your plan, but you had no control over it. It just was in there. There's just a sense of volatility with these plans that, yes, I get your feeling where you're like, I feel like every time we make a step forward, you move the goalpost back 2 inches, and we're like, sorry. But I mean, you are very well funded. Your funded status is continued to be great, and I think that approach where the 80% funding that Kevin likes to offer to people, the idea of that is to say you could fund this plan 100%. Well, what happens if you have a couple of really great years for claims experience and stuff, and your costs go really far down? Then all of a sudden you're like 130% funded, and maybe you don't want that. You probably could be using the money elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's where I'm going with it.
Budget-wise. Yeah, so he says, you have an 80% funding target. It's still, it's a transparent method to calculate it, but you're leaving room for the volatility to take. So, you have a bad year, you're still funding to 80%. But if you have a great year, you're just going to get closer to the 80%. All of a sudden you're just going to bump up, but you don't really ever want to be sitting at the 120 or 130% funded, because you could use your money on other things. You have other things to spend money on, I'm sure. He has, approaches you could use 75 or 70, and that would just, it would just get you to that funding target faster. But you see, under the 80%, you would be having a trust drawdown at this point. It's minimal this year, but it does increase pretty quickly to being $1 million, and then it's at, by 2030, it's $1.5 million you're taking out of the trust every year. So you're really not, you're just paying your PAYGO costs at that point, which you're already doing now.
Okay, what I would say to you is we've been, we've been paying PAYGO for as long as I've been sitting around here, and we've just let this fund build up. We haven't taken anything out of it, and then we thought about maybe we need to do that, or this could be a time for us to start reallocating money towards, again, something else. And we have plenty of people who want something else. So, but my point is that the COVID impacts, revenue-wise, have been slow to be impact have been felt. What I think we're finding in the state of Maryland is that we're doing better than we thought. We would have been 8 months ago. I think so in the county so far. We're do something probably later on today on our latest tax and revenues dispersal, and that would be important information. But I think with all the stimulus money coming out of Washington, D.C. and out of Annapolis now, too, we're going to be awash in federal money that is not going to be reoccurring. And what I worry about is a blip in our revenue streams that say, okay, hey, look, we got an email a day or so ago that the county could get $22 million directly from the federal government if this $1.9 trillion stimulus plan comes in. Now, if we got $22 million bucks, hey, look, we can build something. Maybe we can fix the health department, or we can do something else. But my thinking is I'd like to get these plans to a point, because it's always been my thought that if we got these plans fully funded, that we could actually start withdrawing from them, and that the returns on them, because they had built up so high, would just continue to replenish themselves. Obviously, we got to keep an eye on, how it's invested and make sure that, once we get there, or keep our investments, conservative. But I just don't think we're ever going to get there, because it keeps going up, going up, going up. And that's the part that's hard to get my head around. So, I mean, that was more of a statement than a question, so please,
That's fair.
grant me a little latitude on
there's
just
a lot of
venting.
I know. We had a plan that this year, last year they were just barely funded, and this year because their assets did so well, and they're like 130% funded. So, the shift, the volatility is frustrating, I'm sure. Unlike a pension plan where these plans are defined, you get $200 at retirement, they're a lot easier to plan for. These aren't necessarily so. So, the 80% funding one that we're showing you, you really have reached the 80% funding. You would be getting a trust drawdown, this year, if that's your concern. But it sounds like you're thinking maybe you want to get the plan all the way to 100% funding.
Well, I'm only one guy. I shouldn't say one person. And this is a board, too, and they can all input. But I'm only one commissioner. But my thought process is if we have a goal, let's get to it, and then we can focus on other goals. But it doesn't seem to be that way, because once you get to the goal, well, the goal's moved. But, okay, that's just, I guess the term is the way it is. But I just worry about having additional revenues come in that I use the term are artificial. They're real revenues, but they're not reoccurring. And that worries me when we get, that kind of stuff. So, I may want to, I don't know what the other commissioners will do, but my recommendation would be is if we got $22 million, fix our LoSAP or fix something to get us in a good position with these long-term retirement benefits that we have to pay out. It's nice to have a new health department or whatever, but we got to prioritize what we got going on. Well, if this is your report, I guess do we have to accept it?
There is a motion if the board would like to accept the report.
And hello, this is Jeanette. I do like page 12 in your presentation where it's broken out by fiscal year, where it shows the employer pay-go amount estimated for FY 22, and then how we can draw down on that and then really only need to fund the $4,062,000. So I think that's very nice.
So Jeanette, does that mean that in the budget you would put the $4,062,000 in?
Yes.
And then instead of, you've been using the PAYGO cost before.
I've been using PAYGO, and what I actually do is look at the actual premiums that we're paying on a monthly basis for the retirees, and I've been kind of bumping it up about $100,000 each year. But realistically, the last I had looked at it, I have like 3.9 in there right now for 22. It really should be increased. So if I could increase it to the $4,062,000 number, that's really closer to where our actual PAYGO numbers are. So
Like you're talking 4,330.
Right. Our actual PAYGO is actually closer to the 4.3. But in drawing down, based on this chart, we can put the 4,062,000 in there, and then that'll be how we start drawing it down, which is a little bit less than what our actual premiums are. Because I've been looking at the premiums, and I think I looked at them, and they really are higher, really, than the 3.9. So they are closer to what this report is showing.
Right.
And they are increasing because of the number.
So this would be a change in your budget process and now a change in how we're using this fund going forward?
I think so. I think this is a nice chart, and I can even use this for like the multi-year, and I like that. So, and it is very closer. It is close, and we have been doing the pay-go. But I actually do look at the actual premiums on a monthly basis, and yes, with the retirees increasing, with the inflation, the premiums are going up on a monthly basis, probably faster than where I was adding 100 each year. This is more realistic.
Well, and interestingly, I made a note with the amount of new positions
Right.
that are being requested, that, all of them would be on the plan.
Right,
So that's another impact that, we haven't considered.
right. So this chart is very nice, and I will use it for the budget.
And my thinking is, Mary Ann, it's a different way of doing things. So don't you think it's appropriate if the committee makes a recommendation to the commissioners to follow this model, perhaps on page 12?
I think so.
Moving
Right.
forward or
And I
not,
can
but it
include
seems to
in
me if we're
future
making a
budget work
change,
session,
that would
Sure. Include it in a future budget work session and going over multi-year as a recommendation from the board, yes. I think that's what I'm thinking. Would be nice.
So then there's two things. One is to accept the actuarial evaluation presented by Bolton, and then the second is the page 12 of their report for the new estimated drawdown under 80% funding target, if the board would like to consider those two motions.
Excuse me, I'm just sorry. May I just clarify? This is a draft report, is that
Right.
right? And Carrie?
Tim, did we send this draft?
Oh, yeah, yes, this is a draft report.
So we need to accept the report, so it comes out of being draft.
Well, and I think they asked that we review those sections to make sure their assumptions are accurate, meaning the plan requirements and all those. So potentially, if the board would maybe wait a month and we can do that, and we can review those and confirm that those are accurate.
I think that's a great idea, yeah.
Do I understand that correctly, Carrie?
Yep. We usually send the report draft just to give you a chance to look at the preliminary numbers, ask questions, and then gives you a chance to review what we valued, how we based our liabilities, and see if you agree with it. And then once you're done reviewing it, if you have no changes, we just remove the draft stamp, or we'll go back and revise things. Sometimes we reword things and small changes based on feedback, just to get feedback.
Right.
So if we had any questions, we could kind of funnel them back to you, and then you can incorporate them and then bring the report back at a future meeting and accept it as the final report.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So would the board like to postpone the motion then for the acceptance since it's draft, and we'll bring it back on our agenda next time in final form with either accepting the document at stand or any amendments that would be requested? Is that okay?
Yeah, if the board's so willing, and we can certainly review those, immediately.
Great. It sounds like we have consensus. Commissioner Hewitt, is that okay with you?
That's fine.
Okay, great. Yep. Okay, and then would that also pertain to page number 12, or is that a standalone in terms of a motion for recommendation to the commissioners for a new estimated drawdown?
Well, it would depend on, I would think, the review of whatever assumptions are reviewed and whatever the impact is calculated by Bolton.
So conceivably, what we could present to the commissioners is this is the methodology that we'd
Right.
like to use, but the idea is that the particular numbers may change depending on the final report.
Right.
Also, we have additional OPEB meetings, so we have the meeting next month.
Right.
So it could be more timely, that we're not going to have to
For the budget
wait.
process.
Right, for the budget process this year.
Right. So then perhaps the board would like to approve page 12 in draft?
I think that's a great idea.
And then that way it moves forward for discussion purposes for the commissioners with the idea that when it's final, it could be amended.
Right. The number could be amended for the budget, correct?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
So do we have a motion for that?
Sure, I'll make a motion to present page 12 to the commissioners in draft form as a revised methodology for funding OPEB in the budget process.
We have a motion on the floor. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
Motion carries. Any other questions from the board for Bolton Partners? Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Carrie and Tim, for your presentation today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, you too. And next, we move on to a presentation from Marquette Associates, presenting our portfolio update for the quarter ending December 31st, 2020. And Patrick, we will turn it over to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Dr. Bridget. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all again. So we'll first tackle the books in front of you are clipped by a silver clip here. We'll start with the one on top where you have a stapled about 5-page presentation or so, and then the Q4 report in the back of that. So we'll talk first about the market environment. Like many of you heard yesterday, we start with an overview of the economy, capital markets to provide context for how the fund and the trust performed the way it did and how some of the underlying managers did. And when we get into the report and the other set of materials, I am going to try and weave into some of those other comments we just heard from Bolton, because I think it's important to have that context, because again, the data we're looking at is as of about a week ago, which is in turn 8.5 months of more recent data than is in that presentation. And as Commissioner Hewitt rightfully pointed out, the fund has had a very strong return to end last year and to begin this year, and that will have implications moving forward that you all need to be aware of. So with all that said, we would start with that first page where you see U.S. economy there, again, just to provide some overview and context. So at the top chart on the right there, we show real economic growth within the U.S. Those bars are the quarterly numbers. The striped bars to the right are economist estimates moving forward. And that orange line is the year-over-year number. So that last fully colored in bar is what we saw in the fourth quarter. It's a pretty healthy slowdown from what we saw in Q3, really a historic rebound from that collapse in Q2. But the 4% number certainly in line or very healthy compared to historical standards. Now, if you look at those stripe bars, right now economists are expecting a slight slowdown in Q1. There are some still scattered quarantines and stay-at-home orders throughout the U.S., but then you can see a big reacceleration through the back half of the year, namely on the back of strength in consumer spending and business investment. And I'll touch on those latter points in just a minute, but I'd certainly be remiss not to also echo the comments made earlier around the fiscal support that we've seen out of Washington via the CARES Act, via the December package, and via the likely upcoming package that we'll see here in March. So that's really provided a lot of support for the consumer that you see on the bottom page here. So what we saw during the pandemic at the initial stages was very much in line with history. We saw a downturn in the employment market, and we saw lost income amongst many consumers via lost jobs, reduced wages, reduced hours. And we also saw spending decrease, commensurate with that, but also given the lockdowns, the stay-at-home orders, the quarantines, people are just going to participate in their normal daily activities. So what this bottom chart showing is personal savings, which is essentially just income less spending. But one of the reasons this recent recession was somewhat of an anomaly was given that fiscal policy support, specifically the CARES Act, via stimulus checks, via expanded unemployment benefits, that income actually rose for the consumer. It was more than offset the lost income from the private sector because of the size and the speed at which that was passed. So on this bottom chart, we're showing, really you can think of this as the health of the consumer. Personal savings, where the gray row there is showing the 12-month pre-COVID average savings at about $100 billion. And then you can see right after the pandemic began, right when the CARES Act kicked in, monthly savings spiked. So that purple sort of sand chart there is showing the excess above $100 billion in each of those months that we've seen. And this does not include the December package or maybe the upcoming package we're seeing. So economists right now are estimating that consumers are sitting on anywhere between perhaps $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion in excess savings in aggregate as things stand here today. And again, that does not include the March package coming up. So as we think about moving forward here, as we all well hope the economy begins to reopen or further reopens in the early spring and headed into the summer, the U.S. consumer, the biggest driver of economic growth in this country, is in really good shape from a savings perspective. So we could see a lot of pent-up demand unleashed as we get back to our daily lives, we get back to our daily activities, and we do a lot of the things that we want to do but could not do over the past 9 months. If you move to page 2, we'll talk quickly about the business sector. And it's a similar story. So we all know businesses cut back on spending and employment during the downturn, but right now they're running exceptionally lean. And we try to get on that idea in the top chart on the right. So that series, we'll call it a gray line, is showing the difference in a survey response from businesses where they're asked if their inventories are too low or too high. And that line is showing the difference. And when it's above 0, it's showing that most businesses or more businesses are saying their inventories are too low. And you can see all the way to the right there, that's at multi-decade highs. Now, there are some issues around that, given the hiccups in some supply chains that we've seen. Many businesses not being able to get the inputs and the products that they need to accumulate their inventories, but those are beginning to be reduced. So moving forward here, if we do see this economic recovery unfold in force in 2021, businesses are going to have to ramp up spending, employment, and inventory accumulation really to get ahead of that. So we have two really large sectors of the U.S. economy that appear to be on very solid footing as we head through the rest of 2021 here. If you turn to page 3, take a quick look at the global economy, and the story is very much the same. So if you look at the top right chart, we're showing the policy support. So not just in the U.S., that first column towards the left there, but also across all major countries and economic regions. And in aggregate, so from a global perspective all the way to the right, there's been $28 trillion in stimulus last year. Again, does not include the December package or perhaps the upcoming package. So the policy support has been absolutely historic. And importantly, it really shows no signs of abating anytime soon. Policymakers, not just in the U.S., but globally, have repeatedly stated their commitment to continuing this support moving forward until the vaccine receives, pretty wide distribution and we get to the quote-unquote, herd immunity, which hopefully will be not before too long. Now, importantly, when you think about the global economy, we talked about the U.S., but we also need to take into account China, really the other major player. So on the bottom page here, you'll see that China households are in similar position to those in the U.S., being that their savings rates have jumped notably. So this is a historical look at China household savings rates over the past 7-8 years, and you can see the spike right amid the pandemic. So similar to the U.S., there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand for China consumers. And when you have two consumers in the largest economies in the world, hopefully driving strength in those respective economies, not just does it look for a strong year for the U.S. economic growth perspective, but it should be a very strong year from a global economy perspective as well as things stand here today. So with that said, if you would please turn to page 4, we'll shift gears and talk about asset class performance and begin to weave in some comments as it relates to the fund itself. So on page 4, please focus on the chart to the right where we're showing major asset class returns, where you can see up and down to the left side of that chart. The green bars are the Q4 numbers, the purple bars are 2020. And you can see the first 3 rows from an equity perspective, strong gains in Q4. U.S. equities up nearly 15%, international developed up nearly 16%, and emerging markets up nearly 20%. So the key dynamic when you think about the relative performance of those regions is really that the most cyclical or volatile, namely emerging markets, outperformed. And that's what you would expect at the early stages of an economic recovery when things are improving. Those areas that got hit the hardest on the downturn would be the ones to recover most in the upturn as the economy continues to improve. It's a similar story within fixed income. If you look right below emerging market equities, you see U.S. bonds and high yield bonds. The former is a proxy for the investment grade bond market index within the U.S. You can see it was just up slightly, a shade under 1%. What drove that was we did see a slight increase in Treasury yields through the end of last quarter. However, the other components of that index, mortgage-backed securities, high-quality corporate bonds, actually saw their yields come down. So it offset the rise in Treasury yields, and when you put those three pieces together, had a slight positive return. Now compare that to high yield bonds, which is again more volatile or cyclical area of the fixed income market. Think bonds issued by lower quality companies, smaller companies, maybe have higher debts on their balance sheets, more cyclical and volatile. We would expect them to outperform the investment grade bond market universe in this type of environment. And that's exactly what we saw. And why that's important for the fund is your two fixed income managers, Loomis and Delaware Diversified Income, are what's called core plus managers. So they have most of their assets in the investment grade part of the fixed income market, but maybe between 10 and 20% in these plus sectors like high yield. So given those allocations during the quarter, it was a very favorable environment for those two managers, and they outperformed the broad market, which we'll see shortly. Now we'll wrap up on page 5 here for the market environment. Again, try to provide a little bit more context. We always like to take a look under hood of the U.S. equity markets, and many of the comments I make stand for international and emerging markets as well. But if you look at the sector returns here, the key theme is those cyclical volatile areas outperformed. So the gray bars are the Q4 numbers, and the best returning areas, you can see energy there sort of in that top third, up 30% on the back of a huge jump in oil prices. Financials up about 25% on the back of a steepening yield curve. But back to my comments about them being the most volatile cyclical areas, you can notice year to date, they're actually still in the red. So they got hit hardest on the downturn and now have rebounded better than most other sectors on the way up. And why that's important for the fund is most of your U.S. equity managers are more defensive, like Brown, your large cap growth manager, Nationwide Geneva, your small cap growth manager, a little bit more defensive, higher quality growth managers. So they will have less allocated to these cyclical areas. So we'll see shortly they underperform their respective benchmarks. Now that said, the other key dynamic of why this is important is these sectors, or the volatile sectors or the volatile components of the U.S. equity market, are usually value and small caps. So when we get into our equity structure discussion, we'll take a look under the hood and see where the tilts are, value, growth, core, and things like that. And what you'll notice is you have big overweights to the growth area of the market, not just in U.S., but in international and emerging market equities. So that was a headwind for relative performance for the fund in the fourth quarter. And we'll get to those numbers in just a second, but let me pause to see if there are any questions or comments from the committee.
I have some assumptions, but we can just talk about them later.
I was going to say, safe to say, not yet.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, with that said, let's move on. And if you could hop behind that section, and please, Dr. Bridget, let me know if I'm skipping ahead of the agenda. I know I tend to run on, so please stop me if I'm moving ahead. So let's talk about the quarterly report. Skip ahead to page 7. The first few pages are largely a market environment, which I just covered. So I want to talk about high level on a number of things, and then as I mentioned, I'll try to weave in some of these other comments that we heard from Bolton earlier on. So on page 7, please focus on the bottom chart below, showing the summary of cash flows, essentially telling us, where were we, how did we get to where we are now? So in the fourth quarter, you could see the fund began at about $94.5 million. There was a slight net cash inflow of about $200,000, a couple lines down, and then the fund had an investment gain of about $9.8 million.
Hold on.
I'm sorry, Commissioner, this is in the
Bolton,
asset. Yeah, yes, sir.
And what page?
Page 7, please. I
All right,
apologize.
thank you. No, that's all right.
So in that bottom chart on page 7, as I mentioned, given that positive cash flow and the investment gain of the fund itself grew by about $10 million. Now, if we look year to date, fund began at about 91.1. We had, again, a slight positive cash flow coupled with a strong investment gain, so the fund grew by about $13.3 million during the year. And I'll show in a little bit, as Commissioner Hewitt mentioned earlier on, the fund has grown since then in the first quarter, given strong markets. So if you look on page 8, we just talked about, where were we, how did we get to where we are now? So now I'd like to focus on asset allocation before moving into some of the returns. There's a lot of data on this page. Those top pie charts are just breaking out the current and the target, but that same information is found in the table below. So if you please focus your attention on those middle 2 columns where it shows your policy allocation for each of those respective asset classes, and then the difference, you'll notice a couple of quick things. So those first 4 rows are your equity allocations, and if you sum up those differences, you ended the quarter with an overweight of equities of about 6.5%. So in turn, that meant you were overweight equities at the beginning of the quarter, and since equities were the best performing asset class, as I showed, being overweight an asset class that does the best is helpful for returns relative to your policy index. The other key dynamic you'll notice if you go to the 3rd row from the bottom, the biggest underweight, or where that overweight is being sourced from, is private real estate. You'll notice it's about 5.5 percentage points below its target, and as things stand right now, with the prospects for the U.S. equity markets and international and emerging markets, compared to some of the structural headwinds that I think we're all well attuned to with private real estate, very comfortable with that respective overweight and underweight as things stand here today. But then most importantly, if you look all the way to the right there, within IPS range, the answer up and down the page is yes. So at the end of the December, and also show more shortly, more recently, everything is within the ranges as set forth in the investment policy statement. So if we can skip ahead to page 10, we'll talk a little bit about returns. So I should back up for a quick second and just mention that we also use the same third-party performance reporting platform as your previous advisor. So these books moving forward will look very similar to this. Data analysis, very similar, just the colors, the branding, a little different for obvious reasons. A lot of data on this page, but please let's focus on the bottom table and specifically those bottom 2 rows where you see the circle, the triangle, and then the total fund and target to the right of that. So for the quarter, in the 4th quarter, the fund had a return of 10.45%. That was slightly better than the median. You can see that in parentheses, so lower numbers are better there, higher numbers are worse. It was slightly ahead of that target or the policy index, even though there was a headwind from being overweight growth stocks that was really offset by the overweight to equities relative to other asset class. So you had one key headwind, but also a big tailwind, and they more or less offset each other. As you work your way from left to right here, you can see similar narrative, similar story. The fund typically ahead of that assumed policy index, ahead of peers, and then more importantly, circling back to the Bolton discussions, well ahead of the assumed rate of return of 6% over time, which has obviously increased the health of the fund, increased the funded ratio over time from when you initially started to fund the plan, many, many years ago. You've been able not only to contribute the money and help drive it to a better position, but grow your way into a better position as well, because the return has been higher than that actuarial assumed discount rate.
Seemed like we ought to let you speak first, and so they can explain to me why, if we've got a 6-year average of 954, why we're talking about this, 6%. And 709. I mean, that's the disconnect for me.
So
if anything, I want to put an RFP out for another Bolton. I mean, those guys are getting, that's another day. Go ahead.
So just to circle back to those comments, Commissioner, so the 6% is set by the county. I think it was probably set at the initial inception of the trust to discount those liabilities. Circling back to your points on a couple of those comments where they had mentioned that some counties have been lowering their assumed rate of return by 50 to 75 basis points and the like, yes, that is the trend. However, the counties that are doing that are at 7.25, 7.5, 7.75. They're not at 6%. So what that means is you're discounting your liabilities at a much lower rate. So you're being much more conservative from that approach relative to those other counties, because you're not assuming that you're going to make 7.5% over 30, 40 years. You're assuming 6%. As far as the accounting measure, so the discount rate impact is your funding discount rate. So it impacts your funding from the county, so your ADCs. That accounting measure, while very important, does not impact your funding or your contributions. It's just a GASB requirement for your financial statements. Okay, so when we think about what's an appropriate discount rate, it's the 6%. Your target rate of return, how you're discounting those liabilities. The other is really just a GASB requirement, the requirement, generally that maybe some people cooked up to, make people do more work. But it's just going on your financial statements. It doesn't impact any of the funding, any of the county contributions that go into the plan.
Well, the main problem with it is not mandatory. It's not like it's a what's the term, voluntary.
It's a mandatory disclosure.
Yes,
but
it's
it has no other impact to the county.
And I've said for years that, you got Montgomery County up there at 2% funded, and, other counties are hundreds of millions of dollars down.
Oh, yeah.
And their bond rating impacted. And we keep on wondering, well, we worry about our bond rating. We got to keep these things up. And I've just, anyway, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So if we could shift gears, I'll make a couple more comments on a few more pages before we get into some of our review and recommendations. So if you could quickly go to page 13, this will provide some good context for our discussions at later meetings, and particularly in June. So I assume this is a page you've seen regularly. It's another peer universe page, but instead of showing you the absolute returns, it's showing you risk-adjusted returns. So this is the Sharpe ratio. So just think about this as how much are we getting paid for the risk that we're taking. So in a perfect world, we want to get paid as much as we can while taking as little risk as we can. So higher numbers are better. If you look, and again, in the middle table there where you see the circle, you can see over the 3-year period, it was ranked in the 2%, and in 5 years, ranked in the 1%. So very strong risk-adjusted returns. Now that said, I want you to be cognizant of the fact that, and we've talked about in this December, that the amount of alternatives in this portfolio is probably around 25 to 30%, which has served the fund well. But that's very different than this universe of plans. If you're going to see other counties and OPEB, pension and OPEB funds between $50 and $250 million, they might have 10 to 12% in alternatives. And why that's important is because they'll have much more money into public markets. So a lot more of their investments are exhibiting or generating the volatility that comes along with investing in public markets, whereas these alternatives are valued on a monthly or quarterly basis. There's a smoothing effect. So when we think, again, how much are we getting paid for the risk that we're taking, that denominator, your risk, is being smoothed over time because those assets are valued on a monthly or quarterly basis. So it's not, I would argue, an exact apples-to-apples approach. If you really wanted to get an apples-to-apples approach, you should probably look at funds in excess of $1 billion that would have much more in alternatives than, say, this subset of public funds and OPEBs. So again, it's worked well, but just keep that in the back of your mind. It's not exactly an apples-to-apples comparison, given the differences in asset allocation.
Okay.
So with that said, if we can hop to page 15, I would just like to make some comments around the manager returns, and then we'll shift gears. So at the top of page 15, you again see the total fund return. So if you look at the large cap equity, the first darker line there, that's going to be your weighted average returns from your 3 large cap managers below. If you work your way from left to right there, the first return number, 11.23%. You can see that was below the S&P 500. So a couple things driving that. Number one, as I mentioned, Brown. You can see the first manager there, up 7.9 versus 10.7 versus the benchmark. So they underperformed. Again, it's what we would have expected given their investment approach. They're more defensive, and with those cyclical areas outperforming, that was a headwind for their strategy. But the other key dynamic, if you look to the left of that, you can see their portfolio allocation at 7.25%. Much higher than your value manager, 2 blue lines down below at just 5.6, so a growth tilt in the large cap space. And with growth stocks underperforming, that was a little bit of a headwind because you have more allocated to growth than you do to value in large caps. If you look at your mid cap equity, it's a similar type story. So that second darker gray line there, the quarter to date returns up 27%, just slightly behind the index. A couple of one really key headwind and 2 tailwinds. So the key headwind was within the small cap space. So you have 3 managers here, your Russell mid caps or your passive index approach there. iShares Core small cap, your index ETF. But your 2 active managers in the small cap space, you see Nationwide, Geneva there, and then Friess on the next page, both growth managers. Both small cap growth managers. So your headwind was Geneva. You can see they were behind their benchmark by about 5 percentage points during the quarter. Again, they're a little bit more of a defensive manager, so that was a headwind for them. However, tailwinds were twofold. Friess on the next page, on page 16, they were 5 percentage points ahead of their benchmark for the quarter. And the other thing, when we think about structure, even though you had a headwind from more growth, a headwind from Nationwide, a tailwind from Friess, you also had a tailwind because you have more allocated to small caps than the policy benchmark. And small caps were up 30% during the quarter.
They're also the most volatile.
Exactly. Up 30%. Versus just 20% for mid cap. So there's a whole, it's not just as simple, unfortunately, as looking the individual manager returns, and it's really how the pieces fit together too. And we'll look at exactly that shortly. And a lot of our recommendations, certainly will seem like deja vu all over again for those of you based on yesterday's discussion. But with that said, it's a similar story in international and emerging market equities. I won't dwell on these for too long. But the story largely being that they were in line in the international space in aggregate, slightly behind emerging markets. And again, that's due to the growth tilts. Within international, you have about twice as much more allocated to WCM, your international growth manager, than you do Transamerica, the value manager. So again, having that growth overweight was a headwind, but WCM actually outperformed their respective benchmark quite handily, so it offset that headwind. In emerging markets, similar story. Invesco there is a growth manager. They have about a little bit more in funds than your straight index fund, but you only have an index and a growth manager. So you have a growth tilt. So in aggregate, emerging markets up about 18%, a little lower than the 20% from the index as a whole. So I'll wrap up here in fixed income. You can see that below, 2.5%. Well ahead of that broad market benchmark. Again, because Delaware, they're a good example of this, just like Loomis. They were up 2.9% during the quarter. Again, having less in investment grade bonds and more in those plus sectors, being a little bit more aggressive was helpful for them and for Loomis. So in aggregate, your fixed income returns were well ahead of the policy for the quarter. So with all that said, please let me pause for any comments, questions before we move on.
Well, I keep going back to this thing as I think we're almost funded whether we are or not. And I think we, as a county, have to be somewhat conservative because last thing we want to do is get chasing volatile bets and get on the short side of that. Because we don't want to say, hey, we got there, but by the way, we had a bad year and now we're not. So my position going forward is that as we get to where we are, we want to stay there, and we want to grow, but we want to grow smartly. But I think if we wanted to do less volatile I guess you'll make recommendations later on about less volatility, and because the other thing I see is that I believe there's a lot of pent-up demand. People want to travel, people want to get back to what they used to do, and how long is that going to take to get that out of them? A year or whatever long it takes. But once they start seeing that $1 trillion of money that they've accumulated, which, I agree with it, come down, they may start saying, well, let's take a correction here. So I see this opportunity to stick with the market going up and the economy, a lot of economic growth for the next 16, 18 months. Definitely until this stimulus money wears off and people get, you get those additional unemployment payments. It always worries me that you don't get, withholding taken out of those, payments. But then when your tax time comes along, you got to pay your, whatever your percentage rate of that is. And if you have people who didn't take it out, then they may be spending it and they can't pay it. So I worry that we go and then we have a big drop.
That is a really good point. I think how, our plan to address some of those concerns and considerations is really twofold, and it can be broken down in more the short term and the long term. So today's recommendations, to your point, Commissioner, are largely going to be around taking off some of these tilts and bets in the growth space particularly, and making sure we're more neutral between value and growth, because the latter is going to, or will likely, like we've seen over the past 2 months, outperform in a rising interest rate environment and a rising inflation type of environment. And we've seen that. Now, to your latter point around, being more conservative, and I have a page on this later on in the discussion materials, again, being more aggressive has served the fund very, very well, helped you grow into the funded ratio, the healthy funded ratio where you are today. But to your point, when we think about the long-term roadmap, so in March and April, we'll spend a lot of time talking about alternatives, the role in the portfolio, what, if any, that it should play moving forward, but also the strategic asset allocation, because as you'll see right now, it's very aggressive relative to that assumed rate of return, and you're at sort of your 80% funded ratio right now. So if you want to maintain that and decrease the volatility around that, then you can certainly take your foot off the gas pedal a little bit, because right now your projected return is so much higher than that 6%. So we can slowly sort of walk that back a little bit and maybe get it more in line with a 6 3/4, 7% type of projection, which would not just help us on the alternative side because it would reduce those allocations a little bit, but as Bolton talked about, the draws on the fund are going to increase over time. So we have to think about liquidity too, as well, in connection with that. So we don't want 25, 35% in alternatives, because the last thing we want to do is sell something at the wrong time, like an equity, that then we impair its value and don't allow it to recover. So have more, portfolio insurance, if you will, in the portfolio. So that's going to be a big discussion, I think, over the next 2 or 3 meetings, really developing that long-term roadmap of where we want to be and, how we want to get there.
Well, I think it gets to risk tolerances.
Sure.
And the analysis is that, my analysis, I'm sorry, is that the younger you are, the more tolerance you have for risk, because you have more chance of recovery. All right, on a personal level, that's, again, I'm older, so my risk is lower. But when I'm looking at my fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers of this county, I think I got to be, I can't go telling them, look, man, we had a great tip, and it didn't work out. And people don't expect it. I think they expect it to be incremental and go up versus incremental and go down or have a big drop. So part of it, where I'm going with that, is what I read this morning when I got the paper here. Stocks slide as Treasury yields shoot up. Now, I've always used this 10-year Treasury. I know there's other ones out there, but that's up to $1.51 now. I mean, I remember that thing was down around 70.77. I mean, it's doubled in the last probably, 6 months, 7 months. And I mean, is that what you're seeing?
You're spot on, Commissioner.
Okay, my point is there's pressure for interest rates to go up. Right. And it's also been my impression that when interest rates go up, stock market comes down. Now, typically that number I've been used to, and again, I'm old school, so excuse me, is usually 3%. You start getting 3% or so on the Treasury or something around that neighborhood, hey, man, this stock market thing is great, but it's the biggest casino in the world. And once you lose it, it's not like, oh, well, look, I'm sorry, can I get it back? No, it's gone. And so when we've got people's retirements here, I worry about the...
Though it's a big concern, and it's not just the county's concern. Everybody's grappling with, what are we going to do around fixed income? Because it's such a headwind. But to your point, the best thing that could happen is really equities aside for a second, is a sharp increase in interest rates at a very small period, because you'll get hit on your bond prices, but then you get to reinvest at higher rates. So your long-term return outlook from fixed income actually improves, and then therefore you can actually take your foot off the gas pedal a little bit. Maybe you don't just need 12% or whatever the number is in the fund. Maybe you can tick that up to 20, 22, 25%, and then therefore have that downside protection because you have more portfolio insurance in there.
Yeah, I'm picking. Well, the long-term thing is the part that a little bit worries me. And I was sat in on the meeting yesterday, and they talked about duration. And my sense is, and at this point, a longer duration may not be a good idea, because people are calling this thing a bubble, and Lord knows nobody likes to be on top of the bubble when it bursts. But the key gets to be is being wise about what's going forward. If this economy, quote unquote, gets white hot, people are spending, like you said, consumer spending drives it, and that starts getting out there, inflation's going to go up. I mean, between energy and food and clothing and whatever else we buy, I would have to believe that once inflation starts going up, this guy Powell at the Fed is going to say, wait a minute now, we got to get rid of these easy money policies, and the rate goes up. Am I...
No, I think you're spot on. I can't speak for Chairman Powell, but we'll see what happens if that occurs. But I think, you're scooping me a little bit here with some of these recommendations, but they're largely consistent with the things you're talking about. If we see higher rates, if we continue to see inflation, how's that going to impact what we have now? So can we lower the duration of the fixed income portfolio, which is a recommendation? Can we take those growth tilts off? Because over the past 10 years, growth has done well. We've had a sluggish economy, rates come down, a prototypical environment for growth stocks. So let's mitigate those risks. Let's, take those off the table and make sure we have value exposure, because those are the segments in the market that are going to outperform when rates go up and inflation goes up. So that's within the confines of what we have now in the short term, but in the long term, when we focus on these other issues of alternatives, and asset allocation, then we can talk about potential other areas that might have more inflation sensitivity to them, rather than just making these relative trade-offs within what we have now.
Well, I'm only one guy. I'm one person. I'm the only guy here, but I'm only one. You're the other guy. But the other board members, what do you got? What do you ladies think?
I totally agree with the idea that we'll have a spurt in spending, and then concerns with inflation, and I totally agree, and increase interest rates.
Well, Mary Ann, you're in this field.
Totally agree with that.
Well, yeah, I agree with it. I'm it's, we're crystal balling things, so you have to kind of go with that. So I'm really interested to hear your recommendations, what you're thinking, but it sounds like you're in line with what Commissioner Hewitt was saying.
Right.
Yeah, on the margin, without a doubt, and that's a great point, Ms. Murray. We deal in a world of probabilities, right? Not certainties to any degree, and a world of return, but more importantly, risk. So a lot of the discussion here is going to be focused around where the risk is. How are the equities, the fixed income, different than the policy, which has been a headwind in Q4 and very much likely a headwind so far in Q1, given these large growth tilts. So what can we do to, remedy some of that with what we have right now? And then subsequent discussions will be focused more on the long term.
Well, I think the good news is we have time. and we can be proactive
Right.
about what
That's
we're
the
looking
best
at. And again, if this turns out to be a bunch of, hooey that, didn't, all right, that's the way it goes, I just don't want us to get hurt.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions about the report before we shift gears into the other book then? No?
Doesn't seem like it.
Okay. Okay, so no motion or anything. Dr. Bridget, before I move ahead.
Oh, no, that's okay. Yes, thank you for reminding me. I think we do have a proposed motion to accept the portfolio update for the quarter ending December 31st, 2020.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. And then would you like to move into your, I guess, is this what you called your transition update?
Yes, I apologize. I haven't seen the agenda, but I largely assume that that's what it is.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
So if you could flip behind this book, and again, this is going to look very similar to many of you, and we can walk through a lot of these things more quickly, particularly the transition, because it's been very smooth from the previous advisor. But if you look at page 2 quickly, just what are we going to talk about today? We'll talk about priorities. We'll really wrap that up with the next steps. What we talked about in December, the roadmap ahead, and how are we going to get to where we want to be. Quickly on the transition update itself, but then we'll focus on a lot of these issues that we just talked about. The equity structure, where are the tilts, where are the bets, fixed income, similar story, what's the duration, and then work that into some recommendations, propose committee actions, and then how do we move forward. So with that said, if you can move to page, let's see here, behind Exhibit 2, we'll get into the transition because I largely just covered the priorities. So this is page 6 behind Exhibit 2. So not much to update here. As I mentioned, it's been a very smooth process. So this was a reprint from the exhibit we showed you in December, just what would need to have to happen moving forward, and it's been very smooth. We've gotten data from the previous advisors, managers in short order. The only thing I wanted to mention is the third row from the top, mutual fund share class audit and conversion. So one of the first things we do at the beginning of a relationship, take a look at these mutual funds, check the share classes, and are there any cheaper options available? So if you recall in December, I'd mentioned that 4 of the mutual funds did have cheaper share class options. Unfortunately, we were only able to convert one of those on Schwab, the Brown Advisory Growth Fund, from the investor share class to the institutional share class, which based on most recent market value is about $12,000 in savings a year. The issue with the other 3 is basically the platform, namely Schwab. Schwab and similar type of platforms like TD Ameritrade and Fidelity tend to restrict certain share classes available to investors on their platform. So 3 of them, unfortunately, we couldn't do anything about. So when we talk about custody evaluation, probably later in this year, the trust isn't really paying Schwab anything, but there's an opportunity cost based upon the lack of availability of transitioning into these other share classes, which is around probably $30,000.
Yearly?
I'm sorry?
Yearly?
Yes, yearly. So it's a sizable amount of money that on our sort of regular bank or custodian we could do at ease and implement that. So again, like I talked about, we're looking at the custody, we're getting some informal information that we'll share with the committee at an appropriate time, but we take into account Schwab, we have to keep that in the back of our minds because their fees are exceptionally low, but there's a big opportunity cost there because we can't get into the lowest cost or the cheapest share classes for the funds here or many other funds that we may consider into the future.
So you're kind of hamstrung going in.
Hamstrung to the degree that, we're big believers on low cost. I mean, with the sheriff's pension, we found 3 or 4 funds that had cheaper share classes, and we did it immediately. And I can't recall the savings, but it was in the tens of thousands of dollars. We would have done the exact same thing here. It's so easy to do, right? But unfortunately, it was restricted based on the Schwab platform.
I think the key gets to be, well, tell me, this transition, we got the other guy for a long time. How long does this take? Is it like a year process or a 6-month process or?
Depends on the previous advisor. Here, very smooth process. So what we do is basically ask for these things listed above, mainly from the previous advisor. We just need historical data, like returns, market values, manager contact information, so we can incorporate that into our system, and we got all that. So it's typical for the Q4 report to be done by the previous advisor because technically they were under contract at that time. But now we have all the information so that in June at our regularly scheduled meeting, we'll be putting together our own report, and we have all that data in-house now. So we're way ahead of the game to be able to do that. The key dynamic here was just updating you on something that we talked about in December, but we're unfortunately unable to do given restrictions on the Schwab platform.
Again, how long do you have to stick with Schwab? Is that stuck for so long, so many years, or is it something we have to recommend to swap, or?
Would you like me to jump in, or?
Yeah, sure.
I'm staring.
No, honestly, so that was one of the goals of the RFP, was to hire a manager that could help us with a custodial search.
Right.
But it will involve an RFP, because the goal is to move to a bank or a trust that would serve all 3 plans.
Right.
So we can do that whenever we're ready. And as Pat mentioned, he has informally gotten some prices for us and looked around. And in the sort plan, we have Wells Fargo, and we have a concern because Wells Fargo has sold that portion of its business, and that's moving to the principal. So I think there's agreement among the sort board that that's something that we want to do. So if the board wants to move ahead with that, we can begin.
I mean, I would say I'd like to move forward with that.
I agree.
Yeah.
So you're not, quote unquote, locked in, if you will. I just mentioned 2 quick things for Wells Fargo. We've learned that once the transition begins, essentially, I think in April, you wouldn't be able to transfer your assets for about 4 months. So now we're talking about a long process of a procurement RFP process, so that may be a non-starter anyway. But our intention was, as Ms. Pratson said, to reach out to a couple other banks that many Maryland counties also use, and just get some informal pricing. So when we work through a lot of these, in my head are more pressing issues, we can circle back to this perhaps in the early part of the back half of this year, and then begin that process, if the board would like to move in that direction at doing a formal RFP through procurement. But I'll give you a sense of what some of the pricing looks like compared to what you're paying now, because that could certainly influence your decision whether or not to do that.
Certainly would. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, good.
So with that said, we hop behind the next exhibit. Let's get into the equities, and we'll be able to walk through this in fairly short order because it'll echo many of my comments that I made in the performance report. So if you look at page 8 specifically, and again, I've mentioned this, there's just the observation. So the equity structure right now reflects a large bet on growth relative to the broad markets across really all U.S., international, and emerging markets. And then secondly, there are many managers within U.S. equities. I think the target allocation might be 26% or so, and you have 7 managers in the space. So we could think about, simplifying that a bit by trimming the number of managers, and we'll talk about those exact recommendations shortly. But if you look on page 9, this page is basically breaking down where these respective tilts are within U.S. equities. So the colors will look very different, but for those of you familiar with the Morningstar style box, this is essentially what that is. So if you look on the left, you'll see that's total U.S. equity. So this is the weighted average of your U.S. equity manager holdings. Across the top there from left to right, it's broken down by value, core, and growth. And then top to bottom, large, mid, and small. So we've done that for the composite, or all your managers on the left. And then to the right, this is your U.S. equity policy per the investment policy statement. So you're using 2 indices there, the S&P 500 large caps, and then about 31% to the Russell 2500, which is small and mid caps. So a lot of data on this page. The key takeaways are down at the bottom where we're showing the differences in your actual allocations minus your policy. So if you look on the left here, the key value core growth or from style, you have a big overweight to growth there right now, consistent with the things I talked about earlier, having more in brown than your large value manager, having 2 active small cap managers, but then being both in the growth space. From a size perspective to the right, you can see an underweight to large and mid and an overweight to small caps. So I talked about that earlier, how even though you had the growth tilt, having more in small caps, which outperformed so dramatically, provided a little bit of a tailwind. If you look on page 10, similar story in international. Again, this is the same analysis, looking at your managers versus your policy. So the key differences down at the bottom again, across style, big underweight to value, big overweight to growth. And then to the right from the size perspective, not all terribly different. Large and mid caps are somewhat of a substitute. So we would see that as broadly in line with the index itself. And then finally on page 11, again, same type of analysis for your 2 emerging market equity managers, the policy index to the right, and then the differences below, again, big underweight to value, little bit of overweight to core, but a big overweight to growth. So again, it's sort of a consistent theme across all your equities, which was a headwind in Q4, likely headwind in Q1. And if we do have this environment of continuing rising rates and inflation, would be more than likely a headwind going forward. So with all that said, any questions around that before we look at the fixed income quickly? Okay. So if you hop behind the next exhibit, this will be much more straightforward with the fixed income structure. So on page 13, just a couple of quick observations. You have 2 fixed income managers now, Loomis and Delaware Diversified, both core plus managers. Both have about 50% of the fixed income allocation. And as we'll see on the next page, the pieces put together, so at the total fixed income level, it does yield more than the policy index due to a higher allocation to those credit sectors, the things I talked about earlier, like high yield bonds. But then also, circling back to the comments made earlier, consider lowering that duration or your interest rate risk. So if you look on the next page, on page 14, it's just showing the data around that. So what this is showing in purple for each of these 3 charts are your fixed income portfolio compared to the green, your policy index. So in that top chart there, you can see all the way to the left, your yield to maturity right now is about 2.1%, about a full percentage points ahead of that policy index. If you look in that middle chart, again, it's largely due to an overweight in credit. So you can see AAA there in the beginning, only about 40% versus 70 for the index, where that underweight is distributed. If you work to the middle of the page, you can see much more in BBB, which is the lowest rung of investment grade, and about 15% in BB, which is the highest rung, or say the highest quality high yield. So those sector differences are really driving that yield to maturity difference up top. And then in the middle of that top chart, getting back to our discussion about rates and duration and fixed income risk, that duration is essentially in line with the policy right now at 6 years, meaning that all else equal, if interest rates rose by a percentage point, the fixed income portfolio and the benchmark would go down by 6%. Again, all things are never equal, but that's sort of a simplified explanation as to what duration is actually means and why it's important for your fixed income portfolio. Any questions around that before we circle right into the recommendations around some of these analysis and takeaways? Okay. So in the next exhibit, hop behind that recommendations, please, if you will. I did want to provide you an update on where the fund stood. This was about a week ago. So as of February 18th. So the fund, you can see the total assets above up at about 108 million. And not to digress too much, but to circle back to those comments earlier, when Bolton talked about, their assumptions, they were using, if I can circle back to these notes quickly, an assumption that the trust would end this fiscal year with assets of just $94.5 million. So when you think about the funded ratio, to your point, Commissioner, it's unclear, maybe the board, are these reports done every 1 year or 2 years?
2 years.
2 years.
It's 2 years, okay. So anything can happen next fiscal year, but when you end this fiscal year, if, say, we just end with $108 million, that liability at 116, I mean, I should check with Jeanette to help me on my math, about 94% funded ratio, right? So importantly, again, that may not hold when they do the new valuation, but let's assume we're at 90%. So these projections on page 12, right, your contribution is set by this valuation for 22 and 23. But if you stay with that 80% funding target and you're at 88 or 90%, what's going to happen is that in that huge table on page 11, your actuarial determined contribution is made up of two factors: your normal cost, essentially the benefits that are accrued in any given year, plus essentially your amortization payment, so your mortgage payment to pay off the unfunded liability, which you're not assuming at 100% right now. You're just trying to pay it off to 80%. So long story short, what you could see happen in 22 and 23, because Bolton's just assuming you have less than $100 million at the end of fiscal 22, is that you're no longer going to have an unfunded liability at 80%.
It's I'm sorry.
At the 80% target, right? Just at the 80% target. So when you look at the contribution calculation, you have your normal cost and you have an amortization payment. That amortization payment at that point would no longer be positive. It would go negative. So it would decrease your contribution. But in turn, that would increase draws on the fund, right? So there's so many different moving pieces here. So when you think about this 80%, right, not only is it just impacting the funded ratio and the contributions, but it's going to impact the investment strategy moving forward too. So we need to, keep in mind all of these different moving pieces as we move forward here, based on any changes to assumptions and things of that nature. But as things stand here today, your contribution for 23, 24 would be much lower than what that would imply, because you no longer have a liability to play off. It actually is a negative number rather than positive at the 80% level. All right, so let's look at page 16. Well, we already ran through that. So let's go to page 17. So we'll talk quickly about some recommendations about a few fund liquidations and some additions. So you see the top one there, the iShares Russell Midcap ETF. That's your midcap manager, the lone one. It's just a passive ETF trying to track midcaps within the U.S., but it is pretty expensive at about 19 basis points. So Schwab actually has a midcap ETF tracking the same part of the market at 4 basis points. So I'll show you that on the next page, but essentially our recommendation would be to swap that exposure. You're getting the same exposure, but at a much lower fee.
But what was another fee, 0.4?
I like looking at if you jump to page 19.
Yes.
That he's describing it as he's going along, so I can see them both happening, the terminations and the additions. It's just a little cheat sheet. I jump ahead as you're talking.
Jump ahead.
Now, Rebecca. Okay. Well, I'm all about reducing fees.
Okay, so that would be the key driving force around that. So when we look at the other three terminations on page 17, which are also on page 19, they talking about decrease that small cap tilt that we talked about, right? Those volatile sectors. So let's, try and mitigate the value underweight, but perhaps reduce small caps a bit for the reasons that, Commissioner, you laid out earlier, I think are a great background or overview of why we are suggesting that. Two other ones, Nationwide Geneva Small Cap Growth. Again, they're one of your two active small cap managers, which are both growth. So we would recommend moving out of Nationwide Geneva and keeping your other active growth manager, small cap growth manager, Freese. And then in the international space, Transamerica International Equity, they technically are a value manager, but they're more what's called relative value. So they're, not a pure value manager. They're kind of more down the middle. So what we're going to recommend is a different manager in that space that is very much a straight value play to complement your existing growth manager.
Is that Dodge and Cox?
Yes, Commissioner. So on page 18, we'll run through these additions quickly and then look at the proposal itself. So again, we talked about adding that Schwab Mid-Cap ETF to reduce fees. Adding the next three, would be new additions to the fund. So number one, ICM Small Company. Would be a name familiar to some of you. It is a Baltimore-based firm. They're value-only shop. This small cap value strategy is their flagship fund. And like all of these managers, it's one of our top picks in that space. We have about 5 clients with $75 million invested in that fund. And importantly, like I said, since they're going to be on the value side, it'll be a good complement to Freese moving forward. So you'd have one small value and one small growth to complement each other. Below that, Dodge & Cox International, an equity and fixed income shop, definitely more well known for their equities, value only, located in California. They generally take a look of about 3 to 5 year horizon for their individual stocks that they pick, looking for a catalyst essentially to unlock that value. But compared to Transamerica, again, a pure value type play that would again complement WCM, your international growth manager in that space. And then finally, Lord Abbett to the right. This is a manager in the fixed income space we're recommending, and you can see in the name there, a short duration income fund. So they'll be invested broadly similarly to your existing managers, but instead of having a duration of, around 6 years, it would be around 2. So our proposal is to not terminate the other 2 managers, but add them as a part of the pie, and then source it from one of the
Balance.
source it from one of the managers, and in turn your duration will come down. So on page 19, there's a lot of moving pieces here. So I'll walk through these and then pause for a quick second, and then I also have some charts on how this would impact your equity structure, how it would impact your fixed income structure. So let's start up top in the middle of the page where you see rebalancing. So you can see the first number there. So if it's in black, we're talking about contributing money. If it's in red, taking money away. So adding $1.5 million to your Vanguard Value ETF, that's your large value manager, and that would essentially bring their share of the fund in line with your large growth manager. So mitigating that growth in the large cap space. Below that, the complete liquidation of the Russell Mid-Cap ETF at $3.1 million, so moving out of that, and then moving into the Schwab ETF, you can see below that, which is again 15 basis points lower. The number there at $5 million is a little higher than the liquidation because of that small cap tilt. So the rebalancing will be moving some funds out of small caps back into mid caps to mitigate some of the risk with a small cap overweight. Beneath that, a full liquidation of the iShares Core S&P Small Cap Fund. Below that, you see the addition to the new manager ICM Small Value. And then the 2 below that, a complete liquidation of Nationwide and a slight redemption from Freese, again, to bring your new ICM allocation and Freese allocation pretty much aligned with one another. Again, taking that growth bet off the table within small caps. Any questions or comments around that before I work my way down the page?
What kind of fees should we see a reduction? I mean, is this going to be like all this for 20 grand, 30 grand? Or?
We must think alike, Commissioner, because I have a page on that shortly.
Okay, sorry. I was just getting it.
No, not at all. So if we look in the developed equity space, similar type story here. As I mentioned earlier, you have much more money in your growth manager than your value manager. So we are suggesting trimming your growth manager by about $2.5 million, adding some funds to the index fund, so your straight core down the middle, liquidating Transamerica, and then adding funds to Dodge & Cox, which at the end of the day would leave you with basically a split allocation between your growth manager and WCM and your value manager in Dodge & Cox. For emerging markets beneath that, what we're recommending, since you have one growth manager, one index fund, essentially reversing those allocations. So redeeming some funds out of the growth manager, moving them into the index fund, which would then lower the growth tilt by definition in the emerging market space. And then within fixed income, like we talked about a second ago, essentially just a rebalancing, removing some funds from Delaware Diversified Income into Lord Abbett. Now, just quickly, you see $4 million for Lord Abbett there. I want to amend that number. We put these materials together a week ago. The market has come down since then about 2 or 3%. And if you see at the bottom of the table, essentially we're sourcing some funds from cash. So in order to make sure we have an appropriate buffer, because these values are different than a week earlier, I would like the committee to consider as a part of this recommendation, as opposed to the $4 million there, just $3.5 million, which means we're not sourcing $1 million from cash, but rather
500.
about 500,000. Yes, sir.
Right.
So let me pause for a second. I have, again, a few slides after this that will show you the impact of these changes, but happy to answer any questions or comments right now.
All right, would you want to do this rebalancing or this thing as a motion at the end? What's your thoughts?
It's entirely up to the.
I was just, since he had additional information on the rebalance,
Yeah,
you want to
let
go
it
ahead
wait.
and
Yes,
cover that, make sure
absolutely.
we have all those
Absolutely.
opportunities. Great.
So if you look
Thank
at page 20, so this is the same slide, but now you can see up in the title, new, right? So it's the new allocation. So again, focus down the bottom here. So previously you had an 8% overweight to growth and a split underweight to value and core, which essentially be neutralized now. On the right, you had a big underweight to large cap, underweight to mid, and a big overweight to small at 7. And now much of that will be neutralized. So in effect, what we're trying to do here is take that growth tilt off the table. Interest rates tick up, inflation ticks up. We want to make sure we don't have that bet. But at the same time, from a risk perspective, maybe take some of that small cap overweight off the table from a size perspective and have that more equally distributed across the other segments. On page 21, similar story here. If you look all the way at the bottom and to the left, previously the international equity structure had a 13 percentage point underweight. Core was overweight by 2% and growth overweight by 11. So that has been mitigated down by this new proposed structure. Still a slight overweight to growth, but clearly much lower than previously or as things stand today. On the next page, emerging markets, similar story. Again, big underweight to value was at 9%. The growth overweight was at 8%. So the changes proposed would move the value underweight down to 3 and the growth overweight down from 8 to 3, which we're still going to have a slight growth overweight because we just have the one growth manager and the index fund, but we're talking about changing the relative ratios between the two. And then on page 23, what are the impacts from that rebalancing within fixed income? You'll see no change to the yield to maturity. Was 2.1, remains 2.1. The big change here is in your duration would come down from 5.9 to 5.2. So you'll be getting paid more for that interest rate risk that you're taking within fixed income. And then just to wrap up, to answer your question from a minute ago, Commissioner, on page 24, from a fee perspective, just please focus on the bottom row. So in that middle column, we're showing the current fees paid per manager, the proposed line up to the right, and at the bottom is the aggregate of all your equity and fixed income managers, so about $61,500 reduction in fees based on the new proposed structure. So again, let me pause for any questions or comments from the committee.
Any questions or comments from the committee?
Take 60,000 wherever I can get it.
So then I think that takes us back to page 19 for the rebalancing proposal. And remember, it's as amended with the change in the Lord Abbett recommendation.
That was my question. The transition process will be done in stages. So,
Correct,
yeah.
yes. So we might not, did we get to that page yet? I apologize. Yeah, so there's a lot of moving pieces to your point, Ms. Murray. So it's something that we'll do probably over a week or two, just to make sure we don't have out-of-market exposure, right? So we'll be matching those things up as appropriate and handle that internally.
I'll make the motion that we approve the rebalancing proposal with the amendment for the Lord Albert short-term duration income from $4 million to $3.5, and allocate about $500,000 from cash equities, cash equivalents, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Commissioner Hewitt. Is there a second?
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. So just wrap up quickly, Dr. Bridget,
Sure.
on page 29, we talked a lot about next steps, but just to give you some more details around the projected return from this portfolio, we ran this through our asset allocation software. You can see the pie chart above and the respective allocations in each asset class below. But the key takeaway on the table below right now, our base case scenario would be that this allocation is consistent with about a 7.7% return moving forward, largely attributable to a low fixed income allocation and a lot in alternatives. So to your question earlier, Commissioner, the discount rate's 6. Right now, this is the projection based on the current mix, which is pretty aggressive. But these conversations we'll have over the next 2 months, and then we'll work with an asset allocation study, which we can actually get data from Bolton and show you projections on funded ratios, because we'll get their liability projections. We can incorporate projected cash flows and things like that to give you a better, accurate sense of the trade-offs between different allocation mixes over the next 10 years. But I just wanted to highlight this because certainly we talked a lot about it, and I think moving forward again, that 7.7 number is probably a little bit on the higher end, right? So, somewhere in the middle of the discount rate and that I think would be most appropriate, but those are the discussions we'll have.
What were they talking, 7% on that account?
That was the accounting one, which again is financial statement purposes.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. Anything else for us?
No, thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments for Pat? No. Okay, great. Thank you very much. And so now, committee members, we move to item number 4 for committee reports for the plan administrator's report. For today, I will turn the floor over to Jody.
Thank you, Dr. Bridget. Since our last meeting, the plan has distributed funds for the capital calls totaling $2,048,982.92, and the detailed by call is listed on the written report. The fund distributed administrative expenses totaling $23,253. $18,425 was distributed to Asset Strategies for their fourth quarter 2020 report. $4,603 was distributed to Fiduciary Plan Consultants, and $225 was distributed to Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston for legal invoices. Our upcoming meetings for 2021 is March 25th, April 22nd, June 4th, August 27th, and December 3rd.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments on the plan administrator's report? If there are none, we'll entertain a motion to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve the plan administrator's report.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Next on our agenda is new business with a certificate of appreciation for Mary Ann Murray. Thank you very much for participating in the Retiree Benefit Trust of St. Mary's County. The county commissioners recognized all of our volunteers in January and passed out the certificates of appreciation because we are in a virtual environment. And so I'll read it for you. It says, your diligence, dedication, and relentless pursuit of excellence has earned the community's gratitude, respect, and admiration. We thank you for your commitment to the betterment of St. Mary's County and its citizens. And it is signed by all 5 commissioners. So thank you very much, Mary Ann.
Thank you.
And that concludes our agenda for today. So we move to adjournment. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you all very much, and thanks for joining us. We'll just take a 5-minute break and come back for LoSEP.
Yes.